Okay. Hi, everyone. Yet a new location here for Riot Anatomy, Lesson 11. And sorry, the light's a little dim, but I think I tested a video and it's okay for now. So this is my house. Welcome. And today we're going to be talking about the sacrum and tail a little bit. So I know by this point in your training you have, I'm sure, a lot of familiarity already with the sacrum. So we're just going to go through and label some of the landmarks on the bones and talk a little bit about the SI joint and the relationship between the sacrum and the tail. So this, and these are all up on Google Classroom to follow along, but I kind of like both of these views. I like the bright colors and the size of this one, but this is probably more accurately what a sacrum looks like. So the first thing to notice, and you may already know this as well, but the sacrum and the tail form the base of the spine, right? And you can see really clearly in both of these drawings how the sacrum is really the result of a fusion of 5 vertebrae. So you can see these lines and these divisions where the intervertebral discs would have once been. Yeah, and those 5 discs fuse together to make what we call one thing, the sacrum. So we've got, this is where the lumbar spine comes down and articulates with the sacrum. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 vertebrae that fuse together. And that fusing, I've heard various opinions on when that fusing happens, but it's pretty late. It's not until your 20s, sometimes people say 30s, even into your late 30s, that those vertebrae become fully fused, and thereby the sacrum takes its shape, its final shape, if you will. And all along, and until that point, just like the rest of the spine, the sacrum is responding to your movement patterns, responding to how weight is traveling through it, as the osteoblast and osteoclasts continually regenerate those bone cells, and so the shape of the sacrum and the curve that the sacrum comes to take is really a reflection of your own personal patterns. And no two sacrums are the same in their size or in their shape or in their curve. And I put on Google Classroom a couple different sacrums that you can see the different angles that they take. But before I go into that a little bit more, let's just label the other parts of the sacrum. Let's see, what did I want to say about? Kind of annoyingly, they call the top part of the sacrum the base, and the bottom part the apex. So it's a little bit flipped, at least from the sort of superior-inferior orientation. But the top part is the base, and then where it tapers down as it heads towards the tail, that's called the apex of the sacrum. These are called, these bits, these yellow that I have colored in yellow, are called the ala, or the wings of the sacrum. If you think of it as sort of having a butterfly shape, you can imagine that part of the sacrum that kind of flares out at the top as being the wings of the butterfly. And then along the ala on either side, I have marked in a purple line is where the SI joint is going to be. Let's see, these guys down here are called the cornu. No, sorry, wrong. What are those called? These green things. I didn't write that one down. The cornu. I don't know what those are called. They're not the cornu. I'll look it up and get back to you on that. I don't think it's that important. And then these are these holes. These are the sacral foramen or foramina, where the nerves come from the spinal cord. Through these foramen to spill down into the legs. So that's the sacrum. Here it is from the side. And one thing that you can't see in these drawings, but that's not true. In this drawing down here, you're looking at a at the sacrum from the, as if it was sliced here and you're looking down at it, if that makes sense. Sort of an inferior view of a transverse slice of the sacrum. And you can see how between the back of the sacrum, the very back, and here's the side view, what would be the spinous processes of the sacrum, and the front of the sacrum is a canal, the sacral canal, through which spinal cord and nerves travel down. And you can really see that opening, and where the opening happens at the base of the spine for the nerves to spill down is called the sacral hiatus. And you can really see that on one of the real sacrum photos I put up on Google Classroom. So check that out, this sort of tunnel that happens in the bones of the sacrum themselves. So you can see how how that foramen where the nerves travel is a sort of continuation of the structure of the vertebra with the articular arch, what would be the articular arch, and the body of the vertebra, creating a space for nerves to travel through. So that happens in the sacrum as well. And let's see. I think those are the basic landmarks of the sacrum. I want to show you a side view to take a look at the SI joint. Actually, what I can say about the, just to finish up on the curves of the sacrum, it was really interesting in my cadaver lab. We have 6 cadaver bodies, and the sacrums are just so wildly different. And so on the one there's one of them that's lying prone, lying supine. And as we know as Alexander people, generally, when you're lying on your back and you straighten your legs, right, it puts an increased lumbar curve into your back, and thereby takes the sacrum with it, right? So as this cadaver is lying there in supine, I wasn't able to even identify the sacrum because it was literally pointing at 90 degrees down towards the table it was lying on. And so its pelvic floor was like totally tipped this way and spilling that way, and there was this really extreme curve happening in its back, and it was just wild to see that sort of, I don't know, what I want to say, preserved, quite literally, that shape preserved in someone's spine, and take a look at that. And then to see how there in the cadavers that are lying prone, that some of the sacrums are lying flat this way, and you can see a total continuation with the rest of the spine, in terms of less of a extreme curve happening there. So it's really interesting. It's just super interesting to get to see that in a real body, but. Just remembering that the sacrum is part of the spine, right? And it has its own curve, right? And so it is just like the rest of the spine, even though it's fused at this point, or almost fused, maybe not for Serena, or for some others of us. But you can see how even though it's one bone, it's still very much part of the active process of balancing between the curves of the whole spine. So the sacrum isn't fixed, it's always responding in its orientation to what's happening with the rest of the spine. Yeah? So your sacrum is by no means fixed in one position. It can move through space, and when it does, it takes the rest of the spine with it, and the other curves of the spine respond to it, especially the lumbar spine. And it also is responsive, it holds the memory, even if it is fused by this point in your life. Yeah, the sacrum holds the memory of having been 5 separate pieces or separate parts that were relating to each other and relating to the rest of the spine independently. So even in a fused sacrum, I think it behooves us to think of the sacrum still as having a memory of all that articulation. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say about that. This is a Netter's Atlas, which is the textbook I use for my cadaver lab. It's really, I've resisted buying it earlier because it's kind of expensive, but I sprung for it and I'm really glad I did. So anyway, it has, I'll put this up on Google Classroom. I put a sort of zoomed in version just of these bottom 3 views of the sacrum. up, and I think that it has a really nice side view of the SI joint. Yeah. So when we look at the sacrum from the side, there's this sort of like bean or ear-like surface. It's called the auricular surface. Auricular as an oral, as in ear. So it sort of looks like an ear. And I want you to just check out how if you follow the pathway down through the front of the spine, it heads right into the SI joint, right into that auricular articular surface. Yeah, so the place where the weight transfers from the spine through the SI joint into the pelvis to head into the legs is in the front of the sacrum, yeah, in the front of the spine. So we know that, but it's always helpful to see. And to remember that movement happens there, right? It's a synovial joint, not a lot of movement, but it's a place, as we know, Nanette works a lot with the SI joint and getting release happening in the SI joint on the table, that when movement isn't happening, well, this is sort of a principle that you can apply to any part of the body, but when movement isn't happening in one place, it's going to ask more movement of what's above and what's below it, or both. Yeah, so the SI joint is a place where when movement gets stuck, it puts a lot of strain on either the lumbosacral joint, which is the joint right above it, yeah, and or the hip joints right below it. Yeah, so we want to operate under that principle of a little bit of movement in a lot of places, for sure, with all of those joints that make up the hip, pelvis, spine sort of region, right? As we look for how weight comes down through the spine, it's got to head through the lumbosacral, the meeting of the lumbar spine and the top of the sacrum. Oh, which by the way is called the promontory. I don't think I touched on that when we were looking at the landmarks. This green bit that sort of sticks out when you look at the side view, yeah, promontory. And then right there in the middle of that green area is where the fifth lumbar vertebra articulates with the top of the sacrum, or rather with the base of the sacrum. Yeah? What do I want to say? Oh, just the importance of the SI joint as that point of transfer where literally spine becomes leg, yeah, or becomes pelvis to become leg. So a really important area to keep a little bit of movement happening. I also know someone who has, and I think maybe Lindsay has talked about this either with herself or dancers we've known, but it is definitely, especially among mover people, it's also the case that the SI can have too much movement, and that can be dangerous too. So we don't want too much movement, but we don't want no movement. It's like a Goldilocks situation. Yeah. And how do we know? Well, we know when, again, in my opinion, we look for the efficient transfer of weight through the bones to allow for efficient free movement. Yeah, so enough movement that's able to happen, that the pathway of weight is able to be clear head to tail, but not so much movement that the pathway of weight is sliding and, reflecting in places we don't want it to be reflecting. Okay, so what movement happens at the SI joint? So the movement at the SI joint, in other words, between the sacrum and the pelvis, and the pelvic halves on either side, is called nutation or counternutation. That's the only movement that happens there, or that's the only language we have for the movement that happens there. And we're always talking about nutation and counternutation relative to what the sacrum is doing. So I find this little gimmick helpful. If it helps you, try it. If you imagine my head is the sacrum, yeah, and on either side I have a pelvic half coming in to articulate with my sacrum. So I've got an SI joint here and an SI joint there, yeah? So when my head nods, yeah, it's called nutation, yeah? When my head nods the other way, or unnods, or extends, yeah, it's called counternutation. So nutation, counternutation, nutation, counternutation. So if then there's a proximal movement and my pelvic halves move, like my legs, like in walking, but my sacrum doesn't. Let me make sure I do this right. Yeah, if my legs move this way, even though they're moving this way, or relative to my legs moving this way, my sacrum is still nutating. So even though my sacrum isn't the moving side of this action, let me make sure I do this right. This is nutation, and this is counter-nutation. Yeah? Nutation, counter-nutation. With my legs moving, yeah? Or with my pelvic halves moving, and nutation, counter-nutation, nutation, counter-nutation with my sacrum moving. Yeah? Which would be holding my legs still and rocking my, tilting my sacrum forward or back. Yeah? Because sacrum is attached to the pelvis, it's going to bring the pelvis with it. But it's a different movement than a pelvic tilt, than an anterior or posterior pelvic tilt. Yeah, so this is me tilting my pelvis. Yeah, and then within that, deeper inside, my sacrum can be wagging front or nodding, sorry, to do it correctly. This would be nutation, my sacrum nodding this way. My sacrum counter-nutating would be the sacrum going that way. Nutation, counter-nutation, nutation, counter-nutation of the sacrum. Yeah? And in your experiential piece with Nanette and Peggy, you'll play around with nutation, counter-nutation, and the difference between moving on either side of that SI joint. Yeah, either from the legs or from the spine. Okay, so that's that movement. And then if you think about when you're walking, yeah, and there's that little bit of movement happening at the SI joint and with the pelvic halves, you've got one side, you could say, of your SI joint nutating and the other side counter-nutating as your legs swing forward and back. So there's this sort of oppositional dance going on both sides of your pelvis between nutation and counter-nutation. So it doesn't have to be the case, I guess is my point, that both sides of the sacrum, that both pelvic halves either both nutate or both counter-nutate, although we would be talking about it relative to the sacrum. So it's very confusing because the legs can be doing two different things, but we talk about the movement relative to how the sacrum is or how the sacrum side of that joint is moving. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so proper weight transfer to legs. I think that's kind of what I want to say about the sacrum so far. I think the really useful part of the really useful next step is playing around with it. So the experiential piece is going to be really fun and I think informative. Yeah. So and yeah. Let's see. So then briefly to touch on what's happening with the tail. The tail is a similar situation in that it is also a amalgamation of anywhere, depends, 3 to 5 vertebrae that may or may not fuse. Again, I've seen in the cadaver, in some of the pieces in the cadaver lab, a 90-year-old man who doesn't have a fully fused coccyx. So I'm not sure what determines, because the tail is not weight bearing, I'm not sure what determines whether or not those bones fuse together or not. But I know it's variable, both in number of bones, again, anywhere from 3 to 5, and in whether or not they fuse. So the top of the tail has a little transverse process on either side. Yeah, and then the joint here between where the sacrum meets the tail is the sacrococcygeal joint. And it, in theory, has all the movements available to it as the rest of the spine. Meaning your tail can literally flex and extend, it can wag, your tail can literally wag side to side, and it can rotate a little bit. I've never been able to figure out exactly how to do those movements, but in theory it's possible. And let's see. In terms of orientation of the tail, I think a really nice, because I feel like the tail is the dens of the bottom of the spine, in that neither the dens at the top or the tail at the bottom offer any weight bearing in the spine, but what they do offer is orientation. So it's really cool, I think, to think of the tail at the bottom and the dens at the top of the spine serving this sort of orienting function to complement and support the weight-bearing structures right around it, at the bottom of the spine, the sacrum, and at the top of the spine, the atlas. So I would say they're sort of the tail and the dens serve a supportive role in weight-bearing, not a literally supportive role, but partner they serve as a partner in crime to the bones doing the primary weight bearing in terms of helping them orient in space and find relationship to each other in terms of top and bottom and to the curves of the spine in between, as well as to space. Yeah, for me, tail and dens are very much about this. Does that make sense? Are very much about very much limb-like structures in my spine that I can really play around with, sort of exploring my orientation in space through working with my dens and my tail. So I encourage you to try that on. Also, let's see, tail as a limb, tail as an oriented presence in opposition to the dens. Yeah, I think that's kind of it. One thing to say about tail is tail, and this will definitely resonate with the dancers in the class. The tail is used a lot to mean just kind of like whatever's happening down here. Yeah, so we're told a lot to initiate from the tail, or to roll down from your head and roll up from your tail, or send your tail in this direction in downward dog, or what have you. And just in terms of like language and being really clear about what we mean when we're talking about these structures, I think it's interesting to think about, when I say tail, do I really mean tail? Or do I mean sacrum? Or do I mean pelvis? Yeah, or do I mean, what do I mean? And remembering that the tail has its own life, right? Has a joint. It's not fused to the sacrum. So it can have, in theory, its own little life down there that doesn't need to involve the sacrum and certainly doesn't need to involve the pelvis or the rest of the spine. But we get a lot of direction about how to use the tail to sort of lever the spine and lever the pelvis around. So I would just encourage you to kind of think about that and unpack that a little bit for yourself in terms of what am I doing with my tail, and how is that different from what I'm doing with my sacrum, what I might be doing with my sits bones, right, which are part of my pelvis. And that we have choice around where we want to think about initiating movement from or orienting ourselves in relative to support and weight bearing relative to all of those structures. So I've seen some people in this yoga class I've took with a shirt saying "Free the tail," which I really liked, because I think it is a part of our body that we could be well served to find a lot more freedom around. So I will leave you with freedom, and really looking forward to seeing you guys in a couple weeks. And that's it for now. Okay.